Good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are when you watch this video. This is Helen Jennings. I'm recording for my Coaching Resilience YouTube channel. And today I'm speaking with Sarita Hartz, who's all the way from the US. In which state are you in, Sarita?
I'm in Puerto Rico now.
Puerto Rico. Wow. Okay. Very exotic. I'm so pleased to meet Sarita in person finally, because I've been following her blogs. I've been following what she's published and the passion she has for people who've worked abroad and how they deal with very difficult situations and how to look after yourself when you're someone who's in the caring profession, whatever that could be. And a lot of that caring profession involves traveling abroad sometimes, whether it's as a diplomat, whether it's an NGO, whether you're working for Oxfam, or whether you're working for a voluntary medical organization or in a missionary organization as you've been in the past. So Sarita, I just want to invite you and welcome you to this interview. Thank you very much for taking some time for me. So the humanitarian sector is really important to the running of a lot of things that help people in dire situations. So I'll just quote something from your blog, which is very interesting to me. You say you had so many needs that you couldn't meet them all. The responsibility and overwhelm of this call or work was heavy on your shoulders, and you experienced both compassion fatigue, vicarious trauma or secondary traumatism, and cumulative grief of many painful experiences that occurred as you were a solo missionary on your own, as in not married. So before we expand on this topic, let's get to know Sarita a little bit. Sarita, would you like to tell me a bit about yourself? Why did you go off to Uganda when you were 26 years old?
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Helen, for having me. It's my pleasure. I apparently, when I was 4 years old, I turned to my mom and told her I was going to be a missionary. So I think I always had this calling on my heart. I always felt like maybe I was built a little bit differently than most people. So I've been kind of a global nomad. I've lived all over the world, but specifically Uganda. I ended up watching a documentary that detailed the horrific things that were happening in northern Uganda. There was a 20-year-long civil war. There was Joseph Kony, who was the kind of like terrorist, basically, that kidnapped children and forced them to fight as child soldiers.
Yeah.
So I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time. And after I saw this documentary, I started getting involved in volunteer advocacy work. I was really interested in trying to, at that time, the conflict was still going. And so I was really interested in trying to help bring an end to the conflict or anything I could do to help at that point. And so I decided that I was going to take a 6-month trip and I was going to volunteer at different organizations in Uganda and really just try to be a learner, like try to understand what the needs were, what was happening. I wanted to get some experience. You know, I had been doing some trauma work, but I wanted to get some more experience and just kind of understand what the real needs were on the ground from the people themselves. And so, yeah, I was 24 when I left and went by myself, and I just kind of not under any, big NGO or missions organization, just felt this call, like this purpose. And yeah, my mom was not too happy about it. But I had my little Nokia, cell phone, and I just traveled around, and I went to Rwanda, and I was working with genocide survivors there, transcribing their stories. And then I was in Uganda working with organizations that were helping women in trauma. And then I ended up figuring out what I wanted to do with my life, which was I wanted to help this very specific group of girls in this internally displaced persons camp. And I wanted to, what they said they wanted the most was they wanted to feel safe and they wanted to have a community where they could feel loved and supported. One of the negative things that happened after Kony would abduct the girls is when they came back to their village or their camp where they were living, they were basically ostracized and their children were ostracized. And for an African communal society, this was just deeply devastating to them. And so I opened up, I went back, I raised money, I came back, and in 2008, I opened up a rehabilitation home for girl child soldiers and child mothers. So they had babies in captivity. And so me and basically I had, what did I have? 12 girls and 13 babies. We lived in a house together, and
Wow.
I learned so much from them and the experience, and just was able to love them and give them opportunities. Essentially, they wanted to go back to school, or some of them wanted to learn vocational training skills. And so I would watch, we would get people to watch the babies so that they could actually go back to school. And then we would do, everything from counseling to just chatting with them about life and just kind of life skills stuff. But really, it was just mothering them. And I liked to call us the African birdie version of the Birdie Bunch. We just, yeah, it was really fun, and it was challenging. It was difficult. And yeah, so that was kind of what I did.
Wow, that's fascinating. Amazing as well. As well, I have some sort of empathy with you or connection with you, because I also grew up in Africa as a child of people who were on a mission as well. And I grew up in the bush with the African people, although I went off to a school which had school in English when I was just 6 years old. So I spoke the African language, and I witnessed quite a bit of poverty as well. And I do recognize that there's another side of Africa that I didn't experience, because I always lived in the zone where it was quite difficult and people had little resources. So you're confronted with one image of Africa quite often, and dealing with that can be quite difficult when your own family seems to have a lot more than people who are around you. And that can be one level that is difficult to sort of take in and accept as well. So that's my little introduction of who I am. I talk about stress a lot because I'm a coach, certified coach, and I help people deal with stress when it becomes a problem, and to avoid having a burnout. So to recognize when the levels of exhaustion are getting problematic, and when their functioning doesn't help them to function and to be at ease at their workplace. So that's just a little bit about me. So think what happens, and how do you encounter compassion fatigue? What is it actually?
Yeah, so there's many different definitions of compassion fatigue, but I feel like it's the exhaustion, the stress and exhaustion that comes from being together with people in their suffering, and being exposed to different situations of injustice. That can range from, like you mentioned, poverty, to actually, corrupt government systems, to sexual abuse. And so a lot of times, the reason why the helping professions, they have such high rates of compassion fatigue is because usually they're people that care a great deal about what's happening, and otherwise they would not have become, a social worker or a missionary. Or
Yeah.
so for them, it's the compassion, which is the good part. But unfortunately, over time, things begin to build up and build up and build up, and you're no longer able to process all of the traumas that are coming at you. And so because you can't process them quickly enough, or because they're so damaging, you begin to develop compassion fatigue. And I was reading a statistic that said that 60% of caregivers experience compassion fatigue. And in faith communities, about 42% of pastors and those in ministry end up resigning due to stress, compassion fatigue, and isolation. So it's definitely a serious issue. And I saw it a lot and experienced it myself a lot on the mission field. And that was actually what led me to, when I came off the field after 7 years, I ended up becoming a certified life coach like you. And I ended up getting trained as a compassion fatigue educator and therapist, because I just felt very strongly that there were so many people that needed help, who really had good hearts. And then it just, somewhere along the way, they lost their way, and it just became too much for them. So I'm really passionate about helping people in the helping professions, because we need them and we need their hearts. But it's a lot. It's really hard for them.
So what can be our responses when we're confronted, or we work all the time in a situation where there's a lot of need, where we're constantly giving? What's our natural response to that?
Well, I know for me, and I think this happens to a lot of people, and I read my quote, which was basically I was overwhelmed and I just started working harder. So I bet definitely went into workaholism
Mm,
and perfectionism and performance, because I just felt like, you know, there's so many needs. I have to meet them. I can't let anybody down. If I let somebody down, someone could die. It's all on
mm,
me. The pressure's all on
yeah.
me. And especially because, I was the founder of the organization, so there was that added level of stress. And then also I just felt like, um, being a Westerner surrounded by Ugandan people, I had the resources, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the finances. I had the vehicle that could take people to the hospital, so I sort of became like the 24/7, hour,
Mhm.
medical stop or, basically everything. And so it just became very overwhelming. And I see a lot of people turn to alcoholism, workaholism, different numbing techniques,
Mm,
because you are just sort of inundated with suffering all the time. And so you just feel like
yeah.
you need this outlet, but they don't often seem to be healthy ways in the developing world of, doing that. Like I didn't have a gym I could go to, so like all the things that you would normally do, you don't have access to. And so that
Mhm.
makes it even more difficult.
Sure. So you'd have to find some other a way of looking after yourself. You talk a bit more about, do you feel guilty sometimes at the the height of the mountain in front of you, or the kinds of needs that are in front of you, which maybe you're not specifically trained to deal with? Can
Yeah.
that be a bit heavy, that sort of guilt and not being able to help them as you would like to?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I felt guilt all the time. And I was thinking of this one particular story. So we lived in a war-torn area, and there was we had a employment program, so women would make jewelry and then we would sell it in the States. And so
Mm,
I didn't always, they weren't like the girls that were in my home, so I wasn't always as close to them. But one day, a woman I noticed had brought her infant tied to her back, and afterwards, I saw him, and he did. It was a girl. She didn't look very healthy and malnourished. And so afterwards, I called her into my office. It was like a Friday night. I just want to go home and see my husband. At that point, I got married, and I was like, I just need to check on this baby. And so, it turns out that she had AIDS and she wasn't eating. And so we got the mom some formula, and she had already been to the hospital that day, so she didn't want to go back. So I was like, okay, well, listen, try to feed her the formula and stuff that we gave you. And then if by Monday she's not better, I'm going to take you back to the hospital and see if we can get her some care. And then on Sunday night, the baby passed away. And
gosh.
I was just devastated.
Mm,
I felt terrible guilt about it. I was like, oh, I should have just rushed her. I should have done these things. And, the only way I can explain it is to understand that, like, when you live surrounded by death all the time and it's a normal part of your existence, and like it was
mm,
for these women and these mothers, this mother, she wasn't begging me to take her back, to the hospital. Like she had already lost children before, and
mm,
she almost, there was like a resignation to it, like a kind of like a, this is just what happens here.
yeah.
And so, so many babies died from malnutrition, AIDS, and so it was something that was happening in our community almost every week. And so it was an emergency, but in the grand context of like all the emergencies I was dealing with, it wasn't like the most pressing emergency. And
Mm,
so it's hard to filter out those things when you're in a place that has so much suffering. Hard
yeah.
to know like how to weigh each one. But I remember after that, I got an email. I had like written a support letter to my prayer team or supporters. And I was like, hey, please pray for this mom. We're going to the funeral. And this woman was like, well, it's your fault, that the baby died, basically. And it just like, I mean, yeah, that just amplified the guilt that I already,
Mm,
felt. And I, tried to, and I didn't even defend myself because I knew she wouldn't understand the context in which I lived, but it was really, it took me a long time to get over that. And afterwards, I think that kind of played into the workaholism because
mhm.
I just was like, well, I can never let that happen again. So I'm just gonna, okay, 2 a.m., someone needs to go to the hospital, we're going to the hospital, so I wouldn't
Yeah.
sleep. I would just be driving people back and forth. And, unless I went with them, often they wouldn't get seen. I was the white person. And so they let me in the gate, and if it was just an African woman with her baby, they'd be like, oh, come back tomorrow. So I often felt this pressure that like I had to be there. Otherwise they weren't going to get quality care and they weren't going to be seen. So yeah, all of that just made the workaholism, and the guilt even, stronger.
So it's classic recipe for exhaustion, really, trying to be the perfect person, thinking you're the only person that can help, realizing that you can't help sometimes, realizing afterwards that you take guilt on yourself because you're taking too much responsibility on yourself, and then just feeling overwhelmed in general. How about being angry? How about if you find that the system just won't allow you to come to the help of the person, or maybe the person just not willing for you to do what you want to do?
I would say I'm glad you brought that up, because two of the biggest signs for me when I realized I was really in compassion fatigue and then on my way to burnout was anger and resentment. So, and what's funny about it is this is like human nature, just to normally take it out on the people closest to you, not like, I wasn't being angry with my staff or my women or my kids or any of the kids that I served. It was my husband. I'm like, I would come home from a long day of work and, just sweating through my t-shirt, and I'd have to make dinner and he would just be there on his computer, and I would just feel all of this like anger, like, why aren't you helping me? And why am I, after a long, long day of work, why am I having to do this? Why didn't you think about feeding us? And so I would just totally explode and outburst, onto him. And it was just easier than, having to really look at myself and see that I was just so angry because I was allowing my boundaries to be violated over and over again all the time. And I wasn't taking enough time to, even care for my body. I wasn't eating, I wasn't able to, well, part of that was we didn't have a ton of nutrition available, but also it wasn't being healthy. I wasn't taking care of my body. I wasn't, we would order pizza or whatever, and so it just, especially because when you're working a lot, you tend to like just get takeout, and just, I can't deal with this, I can't figure out how to make a healthy meal right now, and so I definitely started gaining weight, and then I started getting sick, lots of tropical illnesses. But yeah, the anger and resentment was very, very real. I was angry at the country, that we lived in. I don't think at the government. It was very unjust, to be able to the systems in place were unjust. It seemed like the government didn't care about their own people dying. That was really hard for me. The police would often never, help us if we needed help. They have to like pay them money to come help us. There was hardly any social workers. It felt like a very broken system. And so there was a lot of resentment towards the system as well.
Yeah, I can imagine that can also include anger at the political background as well, which may have trapped that country in a situation it's in. But that's a much wider scale. How about your relationship with people back home or people back in where it's easy to live, the USA or elsewhere?
Yeah,
I can sense that there might. I mean, having lived abroad and in that sort of environment, I think there's a certain entitlement that you can start to develop. So like, we're entitled to your support, so get on with it and send us more money or send us the resources. There can also be a frustration that they just don't understand what it's like on the ground. How have you gone through that?
it was really difficult, because, and I think one of the biggest elements that leads to compassion fatigue is this sense of isolation. And so what happens is when you start going through this and you don't feel like anybody can understand, you gradually start to isolate yourself, which is actually, it's the antithesis of what we need, because part of the healing journey is actually connection, and safety. But we start to not feel like we can talk about the things that we're going through, so, I'd call a friend and maybe she's setting up her home and she's buying drapes and, she's figuring out what school to put her child in. And like, these are the things that she's thinking about. And meanwhile, I'm thinking about how am I going to keep, 60 people fed this week? And how am I going to raise money for, medical assistance that I need? And I remember, and I write about this on my blog, but one day, it just hit me, I mean, of course, living in Africa, fashion kind of went out the window, but like I used to like fashion, and I would be like, wow, I cannot believe I used to spend $100 on a pair of designer jeans, and that would literally provide a month of food for like my little family here, you know,
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
girls and women. And just the stark like contrast was just really hard for me. So I do think I started distancing myself from people. And I
Yeah.
mean, I think my family, like my husband and my mom and my sisters, you know, obviously I was able to tell them a little bit more, but the reality is like it was very isolating.
Mm, mm. Yeah, that's just the reality of it, isn't it? You can feel isolated, and you can also believe, well, what's the point of trying to explain it to this kind of people, because they won't ever understand. But there's also the ability to go down to get onto their level and start to communicate with them. I suppose that's what you're doing now on the educational side, is to help people to understand the situation. Can you talk a bit about compassion fatigue? Because the burnouts talked about and bandied about, the burnout this, burnout that. I'm in burnout. Burnout is really a state that happens at the end of a long accumulation of stress that's not dealt with quite often, and exhaustion that isn't dealt with because you don't take care of yourself. I understand you've been to the end of the line in the burnout stage.
Yeah.
That's not very nice to be able to talk about, but it is a difference, isn't it, between compassion fatigue, which comes with a specific set of jobs or professions, and burnout. So compassion fatigue could be a response saying, well, I'm going to scream if you mention the word COVID yet one more time, someone who's dealing with medical profession, for example. Or you can just say, well, I'm just so tired of writing another email about this kind of situation. I just can't face writing an email, and I really need to take a break, and I need to just stop. It also could be the stage where you just get to the stage where you walk past somebody who's calling to you for help, say in a hospital, or say on the streets, if you see homeless people. And after dealing with the same people again and again and again, and their needs, and giving and giving, gets to a point where suddenly you just walk past them, you don't give anymore. I think I've lost your connection, I'm afraid, Sarita.
Oh, there you
are you there? Did you hear me?
Yeah, I heard.
Sorry, yeah. So
Yeah.
it comes to the stage where you find that you're no longer caring when you should be, and that must be such a feeling of guilt. As burnout is more like a total crash, physically and mentally, emotionally, and exhaustion, and it can end up with being irrationally irritable, and you end up quite often leaving the job, and changing directions. It was, so there's a bit of difference, isn't there, between the two. What was your experience? When did you realize that you were in burnout, and did you not recognize the symptoms that you were in this stage of fatigue?
So I think I was experiencing compassion fatigue from the very beginning of my journey. So just like I said, bearing witness to the suffering, the horrible suffering of, you know, children having to murder their own families, and girls being raped and abused, and children dying. And so I think that was always there. I think the things that help define compassion fatigue for me are the things like fatigue, anger, resentment, hypervigilance, insomnia, illnesses. Starting to get sick a lot is a big sign. And then, like you mentioned, beginning to lose that compassion and that empathy. So maybe someone calls me or someone needs help, and I start to feel like what's the point anymore? You know, like I just one drop in a very large bucket, you know. That can also lead to angry outbursts and you know, saying things that you don't really mean, but you're just have kind of lost your mind a little bit. Whereas I think burnout is more defined by this sense of feeling like you just can't go on. It's just like you've hit this internal or even external wall, like your body starts shutting down. So like the illnesses, you're just not able to get better. You're not able to get well before you get sick again. Maybe I think it also mimics similar signs of like depression. So maybe you want to stay in bed, you don't want to get out of bed. Again, extreme fatigue or just chronic symptoms that maybe don't make sense. Like maybe all of a sudden you start developing migraines and you don't really know why. So it really is this sort of like, I've come to the end of myself. And I hit that point probably about 5 years in, and that was after just, really full on giving, and you can hit it definitely sooner than that. And I think I probably was burnt out for a long time before I actually would admit it to myself. Because for me, and especially for missionaries, it's kind of like this scarlet letter of like shame and failure, oh, if you burn out,
Mm.
and it's like really bad. And so I don't think I wanted to admit it to myself. I was in denial for a long time.
Mm.
Um, but like you said, it did end up for me ultimately having to leave Uganda to actually get better and get well, because I just didn't have enough resources there. I had to get out of that environment in order to actually
Mm.
heal my body, my mind, my spirit, because when I was in it, I was just, I couldn't fill myself up fast enough before I was just leaking out everywhere.
Yeah.
And I also didn't have, like I said, access to the proper nutrition that I needed, supplements, doctors. I mean, I had to see naturopaths, and I had to do a long journey of recovery, and those things were not available to me in Uganda.
Mm.
I also went through a miscarriage on the field. I had an ectopic pregnancy, and that also was kind of like the like turning point for me, because I started realizing that, like, I had not been taking care of my body, and it was starting to basically like reject even like life. Like it was just, could not sustain this pregnancy. And in some ways I made the decision to leave because I was like, I want to start a family. And I so in some ways, even in the beginning of me getting better, I couldn't even do the self-care for myself. I did it because I wanted to get pregnant. So I was like, oh, that's my reason, I'm going to get pregnant. And
Yeah.
I just couldn't even just like be selfish, for
Yeah.
once, like
Yeah.
take care of yourself, and
Yeah.
so yeah, I was, but I do think they are, different. And I think that, when you're in that extreme, it's almost like a heart weary, like
Mm.
almost feels like your soul is broken, and it's just
Yeah.
so dark. And I think that level is definitely burnout.
Yeah. And then it takes someone else sometimes to look after us on the first steps. And because we're not allowing ourselves to love ourselves and look after ourselves physically or emotionally. Yeah. So it's true that fatigue in compassionate care can lead to burnout. There's also a different kind of category called what was this we were going to talk about? Secondary traumatism. Yeah, that can happen to people when they're witnessing a lot of fear, a lot of distress, grief of other people. Say if you're a counselor, have you spotted that where you were working?
Yeah, so I wrote about this on my website too, but I definitely went through secondary trauma as well. And they're so similar, but I would say that secondary trauma is more when you are traumatized by the trauma of someone else.
Mm.
So it's more like, for example, when I was in Rwanda at the beginning of my term, I was listening to stories of genocide basically for like 2 weeks for like 8 hours a day. And my job was to make sure these stories got written, because they knew that these women had AIDS and they were going to pass away, and women
Mm.
wanted their stories to be heard.
Wow.
And, but obviously I was listening to her like horrific things of the ways they had been violated and dehumanized. And, I would remember I would go home at night to the little hostel where I was staying, and I would be like locking my doors, like afraid to walk home. Like I started like seeing people, like men, as like, predators, and just,
Mm-hmm.
it just really got into my psyche, that like basically like everyone was out to like sexually assault me, and so I think that the trauma I experienced from that was obviously listening to all of these stories where these women were brutally tortured, and then, kind of almost like a PTSD response where I
Yeah.
became hyper vigilant
Mm-hmm.
and fearful and nervous, and just kind of like, oh, constantly aware of my surroundings. I mean, I was a young woman traveling by myself alone, so I had to be aware, but it just got really heightened.
Mm.
And so I think that would be like a secondary trauma response.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So it's really important to understand, to recognize when that's happening or when it could be happening, so that you put in place, you could say, a protocol for yourself. If you're going out into a kind of in that kind of job, do you have
Yeah.
protocols automatically built into you or into your team, the way of working together and supporting each other? and then protocol of how to get out of it as well, to help yourself at the end. Maybe before we go on to how you feel that you can take steps to look after yourself, and what you've learned, because you were saying that to begin with, you weren't aware of that importance. So you've had to work out for yourself what steps are important towards looking after yourself. Perhaps we can talk about the white savior complex, because that happens an awful lot with NGOs, I imagine, going into third world countries. So can you explain what that is?
Sure. So the white savior complex is basically this idea that we somehow know better than the people that we're serving how to help them, or we go in trying to save them, or with maybe like more of a colonial paternalistic idea. And so we then just perpetuate these kind of like old systems of colonialism in the country that already existed. And so it can be tricky, because I feel like a lot of people that do have it aren't these like terrible people. I just feel like there's a lot of good intentions that get misplaced and kind of twisted. And so I would even say, when I first went out as a young missionary, I fell kind of prey to the white savior like kind of idea. And then as I got deeper and like started to learn from the community and volunteering with NGOs that I think were doing a good job, they were like, no, like you can't just come in and like offer a solution. Like you need to sit down and listen to the community. You need to have dialogue. You need to see what their assets are, see what they can bring to the table. You don't just come in and give handouts. You actually involve them and have them take ownership of the process, and they will tell you what they need, and they will tell you how they can build it. And so listening to that kind of rhetoric really helped me understand the difference between the two. And you have to really come in as a humble learner. And obviously the most recent, this has been very publicized. There's a documentary right now on HBO Max called Savior Complex. And it's about a young woman who, Renee, who went into, actually, she was in Uganda, and she ended up opening a medical clinic, even though she didn't have any medical training. And they've cited this as like one of the worst instances of the white savior complex, because essentially she started basically providing services she had no business like offering.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times that can happen because there is so much need, and maybe the clinics don't have the right supplies. And like I faced that too. But she ended up doing a lot of things that were like doctoring, basically, without any kind of medical degree. And then a lot of children died, and it became kind of like national news. And so it was a sad case, because I do think that her heart was trying to help. And I think she saw so much need, and she realized the hospital wasn't equipped, and she, got equipment, and she was really trying, but it just got a little bit twisted, because she wouldn't listen when people told her that she shouldn't be doing what she was doing. And she wasn't really empowering the local national Ugandans to be like, okay, you know what? You're a doctor. How about I help you set up a clinic? Or you're a hospital. How about I bring supplies for your hospital, instead of like making it all in-house, when she didn't really know what she was doing. And so it really is something we need to be aware of in any kind of helping profession, because compassion fatigue is, I would say, most prevalent in sort of like, social work. You're listening to stories of child abuse, I think horrible things all the time, medical professions, doctors, nurses, pastors, missionaries, anywhere where you're in close contact with human suffering, I would say. And so I think that we have to be very wary and vigilant against having a white savior complex when we're going in as the helper, because we don't want to put someone else in a position of like somehow we're better than them and we're going to save them now. But it's really difficult. You have to be vigilant against it in order to not do it, because it is such an easy thing to fall into.
Yeah, that's really good. Thanks for clearing that up and explaining that. I'm sure other people will be able to recognize that in themselves if they're honest. It goes a different level. It's not just the level of I want to be somebody's helper. I want to be the person who's the go-to person to solve a problem in a company, but it's also cultural and intercultural issue, isn't it, as well? And I suppose also this also happen. It could also lead to cynicism in the end, or disillusionment. For example, somebody who might work in the UN and be posted to many different countries, and always the same, another challenge, another situation, another political uproar going on, and you're thrown into the middle of it. And in the end, maybe you can, to numb yourself and to protect yourself as well, just go in at the beginning with attitude of, well, this isn't going to work, so why am I bothering this? What am I bothering, and to protect yourself from the paradoxes that you're confronted with, and that you can't possibly deal with sometimes. So yes, it's really, really important issue, really important topic there. How about then doing something positive? How about the steps? How about the steps that we can take to self-care? What's really important if you're a global worker?
Yes. Okay. I love the practical. I'm always like, someone give me something I can just do. So I'm always very practical on my blog. But so for me, and what I've listed as important is, first, I think you have to recognize the symptoms. And sometimes that's the hardest part, because no one likes to feel like there's something wrong with them, or they're broken or deficient. And so when you're going through compassion fatigue or burnout, you feel all of those feelings. And so admitting that you have a problem, obviously it's like the first step of AA. And, I think it's the first step of any recovery process, is so basically for me, what that looked like was recognizing that my body was like an engine, and the warning light was going off in my body. And that was basically like, I'm sick all the time. Oh, I have these mysterious headaches and joint aches, and all these things are happening. And so really taking a serious look at, okay, how is my body doing? Like, how are my emotions doing? Am I depressed? Am I waking up with a racing heart in the morning? Like, am I, just my body completely shut down on me at night when I get home from work? Like, just, you really have to pay attention to the signs and symptoms your body is telling you, because your body's telling you a story. So I love, obviously, like the body keeps score. That's a great one. Andy Klober has a great book as well on, I think it's Try Softly, which is about trauma. And you can really begin to recognize like the symptoms that are going on in your body and how it relates to everything, mind, body, spirit. Secondly, I think we have to be willing to change and ask for help, which is, again, for someone who's used to being the one everyone goes to, one of the hardest things is actually saying that you need help. And I really struggled with this, because I think part of what's tied up in the white savior complex is you end up getting addicted to being needed. And so your identity becomes very wrapped up in helping. And so you don't actually even know who you are without the helping. So it's an ego boost. I mean, it is like when you become like someone who's like saved someone's life and helped someone out, and you get this praise and affirmation, accolades. Maybe your church back home is like always telling stories about you, or maybe, everyone's like, oh my God, you're a missionary. That's amazing. You're just getting all this affirmation, and it's like a dopamine hit, and so you get addicted to it. And so actually being willing to change is the hardest part, because you have to be ruthless in eliminating hurry out of your life. You have to be willing to actually take care of your body. You have to communicate the changes you're making to your boss, to your colleagues. And I really believe that asking for help is so crucial, because the healing that we need, it can't happen in isolation. It really does need to happen in connection. And so maybe you don't feel like you have anyone you can tell your truth to, but I highly recommend therapists, like coaches like you or myself, people that can just journey alongside of you so you don't have to be alone, because the isolation is part of what I think amplifies the feelings of exhaustion and burnout, because we need that connection. And so a big part of that is really recognizing your limits. So like just being able to actually be honest with yourself and say, you know what, I actually really can't do this. And so that's hard, especially if you want to be needed. Building in things like rest and relaxation. So maybe taking up a hobby, like something you enjoy. Like I've started taking up pickleball, and so like that's something I enjoy. I laugh.
Can you just tell me what that is exactly?
Okay. Pickleball is like this craze that's taken over. Well, it's taken over America and Puerto Rico, but it's essentially kind of like a faster version of tennis, but you have a hard ball, and it's really a lot of fun. It's really great.
Okay.
But anything you can do where you can do a hobby, for me, like a big non-negotiable has become exercise. So I exercise
Mhm.
every day. And then healthy eating. So I had to completely change my eating patterns. Like I just had to like get rid of coffee, sugar, alcohol for a while, change from no carbs, no gluten, no dairy to like, I would change completely to like salads and soups and broths. And
Mhm.
I just changed everything. And because when you almost have to tackle the body first, because the emotions, it's like you're not going to feel better in your emotions if your body just feels like crap. And
Right.
so
Yeah.
it's just this cyclical thing. And so you need to start with the body. So I would
Mhm.
say, recommend if someone's like, oh my God, I'm so broken, I don't know where to begin. I would say start with the body, go
Mhm.
maybe to a holistic doctor or a naturopath, someone who can help you just get on a program of health and nutrition. I take a lot of supplements, but these are ones that have been like, they're designed, for my body and my needs. I also had adrenal fatigue, which is
Mm.
also like plays in a lot with compassion fatigue. So like I had to
Yeah.
completely, heal my adrenals. But I really tackled the body first, and that's my recommendation to people. And then once you're there, then you can start doing things like setting boundaries, So
Mm.
this is really hard for a lot of Christians and missionaries to do because they feel like somehow it's being callous in some way to
Mm.
set a boundary, like they need to be available all the time. But it's really not. Like setting a boundary is basically giving you and the other person freedom, because basically it's saying what I'm willing to do or not do. It's not trying to control you. So it's just saying like, okay, like an easy boundary when I was in Uganda could have been, okay, I'm going to work from 9 to 5, and then at 5, I'm going to turn off my phone and I'm not going to be available, at night.
Mhm.
I'm not going to do emails. I'm not going to pick somebody up and take them to the hospital, and just really holding that boundary for myself. So I'm not
Yeah.
saying you can't call me. I'm not saying whatever. I'm just saying, hey, this is what I'm going to do. Maybe if you need to set a boundary with your work, maybe you say, hey, you know what? I'm not available to answer emails after this time. I'm really sorry. I'll get back to you in the morning.
Mm.
So it is difficult because it does take communication and dialogue, but setting a boundary is like one of the best things you can do when you're recovering from compassion fatigue, because it's going to protect you and it's going to help you get better quicker. Lastly, well, the two last things I had were rigorous self-care. So I think that the problem with self-care is that you have to have a theology of self-love before you can
Mhm.
do self-care, because
Mhm.
you can't do it if you don't believe that you deserve it. And so you really have to get to the point where you understand, like, you are the beloved, like you are a child of God and you have been created with beauty and intention and purpose, and you are loved and you are deserving of taking care of yourself. And so everything that you are willing to do for other people, you have to be willing to do for you. And so if you take care of yourself first, then you will have so much more to give others. And this was actually really a huge piece for me in getting better, was realizing that when I was in compassion fatigue and burnout, I wasn't actually being the loving person that I wanted to be to the world. And so
Yeah.
really taking care of myself and loving myself first allowed me to be a more loving person. And
Of
so
course.
was
Oh, hello.
this is my son. Sorry.
Hi.
Go see daddy, okay? Daddy. Okay, yeah. I'm on a phone call. Okay? Could you? I need you to go see daddy, okay? Right? Take it to the other room. Sorry about that. He's on for Thanksgiving break this week, so
Oh,
I've had time for him. Okay,
so
but
you're
yeah,
talking about loving yourself.
yes, I think I I really needed to like get this part, because I didn't love myself. I didn't love myself, and in some ways the work that I was doing was a punishment. It was like I was punishing myself, for my mistakes that I'd made in my life. And it was like, oh, if I can just work harder,
Mhm.
push myself harder, then let me just close the store real quick. Hey, Tyson, I need you to grab him, honey. Um, yeah, it was kind of like a punishment, like, and so when I really came to understand the deep love that God had for me, and that he wanted me to love myself, take care of myself. Jesus set that example, in scripture. He would go away to the mountain. He would go away when he became overwhelmed, and he did love himself, and that allowed him to love other people more fully. And so recognizing that was a huge piece in my transformation, because I understood that, there's all these quotes, I think, that talk about, you can't heal the world, until you first healed yourself. And so I really do believe that. And I believe all the healers that are out there, this is like the one crucial piece of information that we need to have, because we can be wounded healers, we can be broken healers, but if we're healers that don't love ourselves, then ultimately everything that we're doing, it's going to turn to ash, because love is really what fuels us, and love is what keeps us going. And so I would say prioritizing ourselves first. So I would honestly, it was ridiculous. I didn't know how to take care of myself. So I would have to sit down and I would be like, okay, well, what do I need? And what do I like? Like, what do I like? And it was like, I
Forgotten.
didn't know. And so, but it's
Yeah.
just, there's simple things. And obviously I have, an ebook on my website too, that's like self-care for global workers, but like things you can do on the field. But, it's things we all know, right? It's like hydration, eating healthy. I do a lot of like journaling, reading, I do like grounding myself in the sunshine, meditation, sleeping. Sometimes I work from home, just these little things that can help us recover. And then the last point is basically just to develop and maintain healthy relationships. And so I think that this is a huge part of the healing process. And this can be maybe the most difficult, because if you have been dealing with compassion fatigue or burnout, you may have been a prickly little peach to be around. And so it might be that, maybe you've burned some bridges, with people, maybe you've, been angry and had outbursts. And so it might mean doing some repair. Like I had to do with my husband, and we went into marriage counseling when we got back to the States. And, but it really is worth it, because the people in your life, that love you, they're also going to be able to say, hey, you know what, I see you doing this again. And like, even now, I will always have tendencies towards compassion fatigue and burnout. It's just because it's who I am. Like I'm an Enneagram 2, I'm a helper. Helping fuels me and gives me life. And then there's a certain point at which it crosses over and it becomes unhealthy for me. And so these relationships in my life, my husband has the permission to say, hey, you know what, babe, I see you going down this road of burnout again. And I think you need to like take a step back, and like, and it doesn't mean any longer that I have to like quit my job, like I did before. But if you catch it earlier and earlier, then it doesn't have the same like damaging effects on you.
That's really good. That's really helpful. So you could also say that having relationships outside of your immediate helping zone is also really good to make you conscious of the fact that it's a job, and there's a different truth, there's a different existence out there. So it keeps you in balance as well. So you're no longer the rescuer of the world that you're working in, but you're just a person who's doing that, and other people do other things. So for someone working in a far-flung place like Indonesia or India, how can they maintain this relationship with people and sort of have a contact or communication about other things? How is that possible when you maybe not even in connection with a phone?
Such a good point. And, I think you're so right to make that point about it needing to be, because I think what happens is sometimes our dysfunction feeds dysfunction. So like if you're in a dysfunctional toxic work environment, your work colleagues are probably not going to be the best people to get healthy with, because they're enmeshed in it as well. And so they're just going to be feeding the drama and the, fatigue and exhaustion and burnout. And maybe you get to sit down and, bitch about things together, but it's not actually going to lead to healing. And so I think that, for someone who's on the field in a remote area, I don't know if they would, obviously I would say Zoom, obviously, like if that was something they had access to. But honestly, developing local friendships with nationals, that was really healing for me in my journey. There's a beautiful thing about other cultures that are not American, that we live in a very individualist, society, and we're like our lone little islands. But when I was in Uganda, it was like, oh, people were coming over to my house for tea, and someone was dropping by, some chapati they made. And, it was very communal. And will be more than happy to sit and talk with you for 2 hours over some tea about what's going on in your life. And I think that I started to lean more heavily into that because I also knew that they understood, what it was like to have grown up in this environment where suffering is so much around you. And yeah, I did start also trying to deepen my friendships. Like, and then maybe there were some old ones that I could rely on, but also making new friendships with people that were like in my kind of field of work. So like, now I'm connected to other like, Facebook groups and things like that are for missionaries. And you can even connect with people online, like sometimes I feel like I have more of an online community than I even do, where I live, because they're just people that get what I'm going through. There's like expat community, there's all these different things that basically you can talk to someone who gets it and understands. And that's going to be a huge piece of the healing process. Because if you just talk to somebody who's not going to get it, it's just going to further isolate you, So I would say find safe people who get it, and then you can open up to them about, what you're going through.
Yeah. So find your tribe, and it's not necessarily the people who all live in the same town.
Yeah.
You find your friends, your friendship group, your support group in a lot of different places. So we're running low on time. So it's such a shame. This is going so well. It's really interesting as well. So I think we just have to skip the part about the organizational culture and just focus, as we've done, on individual steps that we can take. But one last thing, being a martyr or having a martyr syndrome, people sometimes think that that's the way of managing something, but in fact, it isn't the same thing as having resilience. Having a martyr syndrome is one who has to save everybody and sacrifice themselves and goes the extra length every time it's needed. But that's really not going to help them, and it's not going to create resilience against stress or exhaustion or illness. And neither is it actually helping someone to be an effective worker. So the more you take care of yourself with the steps that you've actually raised today, the more you're going to be effective, and the more that compassion is going to be able to continue to flow, because you're feeding it and you're feeding yourself, so you can give and continue to give. I presume then that you haven't gone back to a far-flung place, but you're in Puerto Rico, but you're still giving in one sense. Do you think that there's a period of time when people in the compassion industry, as you could call it, find that they need to move on, or can they constantly be renewed and able to continue in that kind of work?
It's a really good question. I did step away from the nonprofit sector and like the mission sector for, I want to say it was about 3 years. And during that time, thankfully I did have, my husband, he was working. And so I was also during that time trying to get pregnant. So there was kind of a lot going on, but I decided to just focus on myself for a while. And I actually took up writing again, which was a passion of mine. And now I have like, some books that are going to be coming out, next year. And so I was able to still give, like my blogging was still a form of giving, but it was a way that I had the margin for, and I had the capacity for. And so I would say that, if it is a point of burnout, it might need to be, for some missionaries, it might be a sabbatical, people that are in ministry or pastors or clergy, it could look like that. It could look like taking a very extended vacation or doing some kind of a retreat that's, designed for this kind of stuff where you really get deep inner healing. It could be, I think though that for me, the reality is like, I'm always going to be in ongoing therapy. Like I believe in the therapeutic process. And I think that if you are in the field and you're just in compassion fatigue, then definitely speaking with a counselor could probably help keep you, like maintain you, basically. It's like, let me get my oil changed, but if you're all the way to burnout, sadly, I think the reality is, if you have the privilege of being able to step away from your job, then you might need to do that for a period of time until you can just really, focus on mind, body, spirit. And then if you're able to do that, then you can always come back either to that profession or a kind of like a similar profession. Like the work that I do now with coaching and counseling and stuff is similar to what I did in Uganda, but I do it in a way that, I'm not over scheduling myself, and the writing that I do is something that I so enjoy. And so
Yeah.
it gives me life. And so
Mhm.
I'm able to help people, but just in a different way. So
Yeah.
I think that would mean my prayer for people out there that,
Mm.
maybe that they could still continue, but just when they feel like they're able to and well enough to.
Yeah. So it's be a sort of self-awareness and putting in place these protective measures and self-care, but in a way that so you end up finding the road for you. You find the pathway which allows you to do both what you're passionate about and provide the help for people, and yet look after yourself at the same time. So basically, you end up in a really good place.
Yeah.
That's the theory, isn't it?
Yes.
So
And
your
having
ebook is
through it.
called Self-Care for Global Workers, and you can download it from your blog. Is that right?
Yeah. So I have a few ebooks out. I have Self-Care for Global Workers is the first one that I wrote, and that is specifically for like missionaries, global workers, expats, and it has like tools specifically to the mission field. And so basically, if you go to my website in the sidebar, you can just put your email in, and then you'll get a link. And then I also have a new one I just wrote, which is a Global Workers Guide to Resilience and Reentry. So that's all about if you're going through any kind of reentry experience, transition, has some like practical things I've learned in there. And then I have an ebook for moms too, for who are
Yeah,
exhausted and burned out, which all moms are right now in the
it
world.
seems. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you offer coaching and accompanying people who've gone through a hard time, and they just need some pointers along the way to get better.
Yeah, I help people heal from some of the experiences that they've been through and kind of serve as like a empathetic support system,
Mm,
basically. And then you mentioned if I had any books or other things that I recommend.
yeah.
Things that have helped me are there's something called the Compassion Fatigue workbook. I
Hmm.
think it's Francois Mathieu, maybe it's a French person. um,
Maybe.
and that was really helpful for me. I went through that when I was going through compassion fatigue, and it has like exercises you can do and different kind of like therapeutic tools you can use. And then there's Overcoming Compassion Fatigue by Charisse Nance. And then I really enjoyed Shauna Niequist's book, Present Over Perfect. That was really helpful
Mm,
for me. And then I recommend anything on like learning more about the Enneagram, because understanding your personality type can help you. Like for me as a helper, I learned, oh, like this is what it looks like for me to be healthy. This is what it looks like for me to be unhealthy. And that was
mm,
really, really good for me.
yeah.
And then I really enjoyed The Artist's Way, which is it's written for like artists and creatives and writers, but it really helped me get in touch with like my desires and like, oh, like what would sound fun for me today, or like take myself on a little date to a bookshop, and like things that I just normally wouldn't have given myself the permission to do. It really
Yeah.
helped me do that. So I really like
Yeah.
that, like kind of finding your voice again. Like if you don't even know what you like anymore or what fuels you or what fills you, it's really helpful for that.
Mm, yeah. It's a long process, I suppose. Getting to know yourself and also putting in place that sort of care and any help. That sounds great. I must look at some of those authors that you mentioned, but I don't know them. So thank you so much, Sarita, for sharing your experience, very down-to-earth experience, very real experience, and it hasn't been easy, but very inspirational to help people to take stock of where they're at and to know how to move forward and to look after themselves. And that's just fantastic. It's really encouraging. And also, if anybody's watching, they can also contact myself for a free session of coaching to get a full evaluation questionnaire of where you're at on the level of compassion fatigue, or if you're actually at a stage where you might be at risk of a burnout. And I can help people walk through that and find out how they can put in place a plan of action, which includes some of the measures that you've mentioned today. So thank you so much. And we'll put the full details on the description of the YouTube so that people can look for your link and download your book and everything else. Okay, thank you so much, Sarita, and look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Bye for now.